There is a dam that nobody wanted to talk about, not because it was a secret, but because the people who built it knew from the very beginning what it might one day do. It took 20 years to finish, 20 years of arguments, warnings, protests, and silenced engineers. 20 years of governments changing, budgets collapsing, and dead men being replaced by new ones who asked no questions. And when it was finally done, when the last concrete was poured and the water began to rise, the world called it a triumph of modern engineering. They put it on stamps, they brought in cameras, they gave speeches. But deep inside the structure, something was already wrong. Something that the original designers had flagged in 1972. Something that 3 separate engineering reports had warned about. Something that was buried, quietly, deliberately, in a filing cabinet in a government office that no longer exists. This is not a story about a dam breaking. This is a story about why it was always going to break, and why the people in power spent 2 decades making sure you would never find out. It was 1969. A small team of Soviet-trained engineers arrived at a remote river valley in Tajikistan. The valley was narrow, the walls were steep, the river below moved fast and cold. On paper, it was the perfect location. A natural funnel, a geologist's dream. The plan was simple: build the tallest dam in the world. Not for power alone, but to prove something, to prove that a nation could bend nature to its will. The project was called Nurek, and the man put in charge of it was a 44-year-old structural engineer named Alexei Dronov. Dronov had spent his career building bridges in Siberia. He knew stone, he knew pressure, he knew what water could do when it had nowhere to go. And from his very first inspection of the Nurek site, he was not comfortable. The riverbed beneath the proposed dam was not solid rock. It was a layered mix of sediment, compressed clay, and ancient fault lines running in 3 different directions. He wrote a report. He filed it with the Soviet Ministry of Energy. He requested a full geological review before any construction began. The ministry wrote back in 6 days. They told him construction would begin as scheduled. They told him the geological concerns had been reviewed internally. They told him his job was to build, not to question. Dronov signed the papers. He had a family, he had a career, he had no real choice. But before he signed, he quietly made a copy of his original report and gave it to someone he trusted completely, a junior engineer, a young man named Ruslan Mamedov. That copy would not surface again for 31 years. Construction on Nurek Dam began in 1961, not 1969. That's the first thing most people get wrong. The Soviet government had already broken ground 8 years before Dronov even arrived. He wasn't brought in to design the dam. He was brought in because the first chief engineer had disappeared. No announcement, no resignation letter, no explanation. One morning, Viktor Savin was in charge of the largest dam project in Soviet history. The next morning, his office was empty. His name was removed from the project files. His contributions were credited to no one. He simply stopped existing professionally. And nobody asked why. That was the climate. That was the world Dronov stepped into when he put on his hard hat for the first time at Nurek. By 1965, the dam's foundation was already showing stress fractures, small ones, hairline cracks in the eastern base wall. The on-site engineers documented them carefully. They submitted weekly reports to Moscow. Moscow responded by changing the reporting format. From that point forward, engineers were only required to report cracks wider than 4 centimeters. Hairline fractures did not need to be mentioned. Officially, they did not exist. The dam kept rising. Concrete was poured in winter, which weakens bonding. Deadlines were moved forward twice. Workers were brought in from 4 different Soviet republics, many of them untrained. And through all of it, Ruslan Mamedov, the young engineer who held Dronov's secret report, kept his head down, kept his mouth shut, kept watching. But in 1971, something happened at the dam site that changed everything. Something that was never recorded in any official Soviet document. Something 3 workers witnessed, and 2 of them never spoke about again. In the summer of 1971, the water reservoir behind Nurek Dam began filling for the first time. It was a test phase, controlled, monitored, carefully managed. At least, that's what the report said. But on the night of August 14th, something shifted. Deep beneath the eastern foundation wall, The ground moved, not an earthquake, not a tremor registered on any regional seismograph. Something internal, something localized. A pocket of compressed clay beneath the base layer simply collapsed. The shift was less than 11 centimeters, but in dam engineering, 11 centimeters is not a small number. It is a catastrophic number. 3 workers on the night shift felt it. A foreman, named Gennady Petrov, dropped to his knees and pressed his hand flat against the concrete floor. He said he could feel the vibration moving through his palm like a living thing. He reported it immediately to the site supervisor. The site supervisor filed a report to Moscow the following morning. Moscow's response arrived 4 days later. The report had been reclassified. Petrov was transferred to a dam project in Kazakhstan within the week. The second worker, who witnessed the shift, was reassigned to administrative duties far from the site. The third worker, a 26-year-old construction inspector named Timur Askarov, simply requested a transfer himself. He had seen what happened to the others. He understood the message. But before he left, he found Ruslan Mamedov. He told him what he had felt that night, what he had seen in Petrov's eyes, and Mamedov, who had been quietly carrying Dronov's original warning for 2 years, finally decided he could no longer stay silent. He began writing a letter, addressed not to Moscow, but to a man in London. The man in London was named Dr. Harold Fenwick, a British civil engineer who had spent 15 years studying Soviet infrastructure projects from the outside. He had no access to classified documents, no government contacts inside the USSR, but he had something more dangerous, a published paper from 1968 in which he had mathematically predicted that Nurek Dam was sitting on an unstable geological base. He had written it using only publicly available Soviet construction data, and he had been completely ignored. Mamedov's letter reached Fenwick in March of 1972. It was handwritten, smuggled out through a Soviet academic exchange program, hidden inside the binding of a structural engineering textbook. When Fenwick read it, he later told a colleague it was the most frightening document he had ever held in his hands, because it confirmed everything, every calculation, every geological concern, every warning he had published and been dismissed for. Fenwick immediately contacted the International Commission on Large Dams. He submitted a formal request for an independent inspection of Nurek. The request was denied. The Soviet Union was not obligated to allow foreign inspection of domestic infrastructure. Fenwick went to the press. 2 British newspapers agreed to run the story. Both pulled the articles before publication. No explanation was given to Fenwick directly, but one editor quietly told him that pressure had come from above. From where exactly, he refused to say. Fenwick spent the next 4 years trying to be heard, 4 years of closed doors, unanswered letters and cancelled meetings, and then in 1976, he vanished from public life completely. His published papers were quietly removed from 2 major engineering journals, and Nurek Dam kept rising, kept filling, getting closer every single year to the moment Dronov had warned about in 1969. The moment nobody was allowed to talk about. Nurek Dam was officially completed in 1980, after 20 years of construction, after 3 chief engineers, after dozens of suppressed reports, transferred workers, and silenced voices. It stood 300 meters tall, the tallest dam in the world at the time, and the Soviet government celebrated it like a monument to human achievement. What they did not announce was that the dam had already experienced 17 separate internal stress events during its construction phase. 17, each one documented by on-site engineers, each one reclassified, minimized, or simply erased from the official record. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, those records didn't disappear. They transferred to the newly formed government of Tajikistan, and for years, they sat in storage, unsorted, unread, forgotten, until 2003, when a young Tajik engineer named Davron Nazarov was assigned to conduct a routine structural assessment of Nurek. He was given access to a storage room full of old Soviet files. He expected maintenance logs. What he found instead was Dronov's original 1969 report. Still in its original envelope, still carrying the handwritten note from Mamedov on the front, Nazarov read it in 4 hours straight. Then he sat in silence for a long time. Because the structural concerns Dronov had raised in 1969 were not historical problems, they were present ones. The geological fault lines beneath Nurek Dam had never been properly addressed. Not in 1969, not in 1980, not in 1991. They were still there, shifting, slowly, quietly. Nurek Dam today holds back over 10 cubic kilometers of water, directly upstream from nearly 2 million people, and the full findings of Nazarov's 2003 assessment have never been made public. If this story made you feel something, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel exists for. Subscribe because the next story is already waiting, and it is just as real as this one.